Okay, hello everyone. Make sure I've got my chat box showing up. So remember, for these live sessions, so hello to all of my students out there who are catching this, and then if we have any guests, thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be covering the first part for my students of the central, or really it's the peripheral nervous system as well, but we summarize that as the nervous system. And so for my students, we'll be really focusing on the spinal cord and spinal nerves today, as is the case with these live sessions because we're having to do online school now. If you have any questions, I'll be kind of glancing at the side on the chat box. You are welcome to submit any questions. And what I really like to use these Friday sessions for are more of a brief, how you would have heard it in class, and then certainly a review for my students who can't make it during this time. So first things first, I hope everyone is doing well out there and you guys are hanging in with all this isolation and quarantine things that we have going on. So I hope you guys are staying well out there, and always let me know how I can help you get through that. Okay, so with the central nervous system, we want to remember that there are two main parts of the central nervous system. So when you think central, you should think center of the body. So what two parts do you think make up the central nervous system? And hopefully you're saying the brain and the spinal cord, and that is actually correct. So this week we're going to focus on the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. Next week we're going to delve into the brain, which is super fun. Super fun stuff. But we do need to know at this point that the central nervous system is made up of those two main parts. The peripheral nervous system is made up of the spinal nerves and the roots, which is what we're going to focus on today. And as you guys know, if you've started this in lecture, the nervous system is makes you nervous because of how much there is. There's just a lot of organization to it. So I recommend at the very beginning, okay, and if you know, my students out there, you know, this is my style. We like to start very big picture, very simplistic, and then we can always zoom in. We can always refine details. But if we don't even know what the main big picture is, how are we going to be able to understand those nitty-gritty details? So let's look at a neuron, and I'm going to wheel us over. I'm on wheels this week. Last week I was sitting in my chair, but I don't think that's going to work for this. So let's kind of look at these two examples. I'm going to talk about these in more detail, but we just want to make sure that number one, we know what a neuron is. So a neuron is going to be a nerve cell, and we have different parts of the neuron. So I'll just use this example just to go over the basic anatomy of a neuron. By the way, I have something like 9 videos on my channel for the nervous system as it stands. I will be making more content for that. But if at any time, you know, I'm going too fast or you're not sure, you want to take a closer look at that, go to my homepage. I made playlists based on different organ systems. And so just click nervous system. And then I made a whole video just on neuron anatomy. So that might be good for you to check that and review these terms. So the first thing we want to start off with is this part right here, which is called the cell body. It's also referred to as the soma, and soma means body. Okay, so the cell body is right here. And then we're going to have some projections that come off of the cell body, and those are dendrites. Okay, dendrites make up the receptive end of the neuron. So remember that a neuron is going to transmit signals to the body, and so signals will essentially come in this way, and then they're going to propagate kind of down in that direction per what I have on the board. We'll have a long process come off of the neuron, and that is called, or excuse me, off of the cell body, and that is called the axon. Okay, the axon is what will connect these little processes down here. These will actually connect to either another neuron, like they'll kind of make a connection like so, or they can attach to muscles, or they can attach to glands, but that is basically what your body uses to propagate electrical signals or electrical communication throughout the body. Here along the axon, I don't have it shown here. I'll go ahead and pull up my lab manual because I forgot to bring the model. Okay, so here, what we would call this, based on what I drew, an unmyelinated axon. It means, means we don't have a myelin sheath covering the axon. So what is the myelin sheath? Do you see how in this image right here, we have these little like units right here, these little structures? Those are specialized cells that create what we call the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is primarily made up of lipids, and those are really important. Let me keep this up here. You'll notice in between each section of myelin, we have a little gap. Those are historically called nodes of Ranvier, but we also call those neurofibril nodes. And those neurofibril nodes are important because in myelinated neurons, what that allows is for a faster propagation of signal, or another way to think of that is that the signal can travel faster down this axon. Remember, the signal is going to come in the receptive end, and then it'll go down like that to the next neuron or muscle or gland, whatever. If you recall these big words, we have depolarization and repolarization. Those involve voltage-gated channels. That is a cycle that has to happen in order for the communication to continue. So the important thing that I want you guys to understand is that when we have myelinated neurons, that depolarization, repolarization cycle only occurs within these little nodes right here, these neurofibril nodes. That's what we refer to as saltatory conduction. I don't know why I did that. It's saltatory conduction, but it jumps. That's where my fingers needed to be. That signal kind of jumps and travels between those little nodes. If we don't have myelinated axons, as like what I have shown here, that depolarization, repolarization just kind of has to go like so all the way down. So you can see that myelinated axons allow for a faster transmission of signal. And again, I like to talk about this. I'd like to talk about this more. If you have any questions, then you can just type them. But I do have a video just about the neuron anatomy and some cool kind of clinical stuff we can think about in regards to that. So the next thing I'd like to discuss are kind of putting these two things together. So we can talk about, or name, I should say, these neurons based on their physical appearance or what job they do. So form follows function. My students, we say this all the time. That's my favorite concept and thing to say in A&P. Form refers to the anatomy. What does it physically look like? Function, what job does it do in the body? And so these are just two examples. We have neurons that have other appearances, but we're just going to focus on these two right here. And also for my students, you guys know that I love to color code, and color coding is important when we're trying to organize information into our heads. So if we were to just look at the structural classification, so ask yourself real fast, okay, structural classification, structure, that probably describes what that neuron looks like, and you would be right. So if we just kind of compare these two here, you can see they obviously appear differently, but how so? Let's start with the cell body. The cell body has one little process coming off of it, and that's really important. You want to focus on the cell body when you're naming the structural classification of a neuron. So because we only have one process coming off, we call that a unipolar neuron. Uni meaning one. Okay, so one pole. One pole is coming off of this cell body. So therefore, when a neuron looks like this, its structural classification is a unipolar neuron. Let's look over here. How many processes are coming off of this cell body? Maybe you're 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, it doesn't really matter. There's a lot of them, right? And so when we say that there are multiple processes coming off the cell body, that is a multipolar neuron. Okay, so multiple processes coming off the cell body, multipolar. Let's now talk about the functional classification, meaning, okay, that's what they look like. So who cares? What job do they do? A unipolar neuron transmits sensory information to the central nervous system. So when you think of sensory, what does that make you think of? And I always recommend that in AP that you guys are pausing and you're thinking about the terminology, because the terminology is often very descriptive of what we're looking at. That's a really nice thing in AP. So if you're thinking, okay, sensory, that means I'm going to be sensing something. And that information is going to be taken to my central nervous system. Some information goes all the way to the brain. Other pieces of information just go to the spinal cord, actually. A reflex that I'll go over later is an example of that. The spinal cord gives us enough, gives the body enough information to be able to do things, which is pretty cool to think about. So these unipolar neurons carry sensory information. This term, afferent, okay, means to go towards. So to go towards what? The central nervous system. So if I were to, I like to talk about this example a lot because it's very easy to pick up on. And most of us have actually done this. You put your hand on a hot stove, okay, or anything hot. Last night when I was making more face masks, I put my arm on the iron. That was silly, right? What do you think I did immediately? Yoink that away. Why did that happen? It actually happened before I even really thought of what was going on, and I just felt the pain afterwards. But when you touch something hot, for instance, you're going to have receptors in your skin that are going to pick up on that painful stimulus. That sensory information goes to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord is going to tell your body what to do, and then you're going to have information leave the spinal cord and tell your arm, the skeletal muscles in your arm, to pull away. So this afferent term means to go towards. So unipolar neurons bring sensory information towards the central nervous system. I also like to mispronounce this word on purpose. You pronounce it afferent, but I like to say afferent. And the reason why is because we are about to see a term that looks very similar to this, and especially in a lecture setting when I'm just talking and I'm using both. I know it can get very easy to mix up those words, so I'd like to really emphasize both. So afferent, it's because this word afferent starts with the letter A. This neuron will bring information to the central nervous system. So now let's go over to this one over here. Here we have the multipolar neuron. It is a motor neuron. Okay, what do you think of when you see that word motor? Hopefully you're thinking of movement. And yes, you would be correct. Movement, M for motor, M for movement. And so all neurons in the body that cause us to make some type of movement look like this. They have that multipolar shape. We also call this the efferent neuron, or it's on the efferent pathway, meaning the sensory information was brought to the central nervous system. Our central nervous system processes that information. And now this is going to tell the body parts what to do. It might be a muscle, it might be a gland. Okay, so in the example I'm using, I'm talking about a muscle. So this neuron will tell the body what to do. I like to say, so you pronounce this word efferent, but I like to say efferent. I like to mispronounce it on purpose because E for exits the central nervous system. That information is going to exit. Okay, so afferent, efferent sounds very similar, so I like to say afferent, efferent. Let's see, what else can I say about that? If you guys have any questions like that, let's see. Okay, great question. Is that what causes a ganglion? So clarify what you mean by ganglion. Are you talking about the, we have a dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion? A ganglion refers to kind of a group, and so we are going to come back to that term with the unipolar neurons. Yes, okay, so let me hold up another model here to show this. I think this is a really good model to illustrate this point. So here we have sensory receptors. Okay, these might be sensory receptors in the skin, for example. So I'm touching something hot. And then that information, that sensory information, gets sent to the central nervous system. Here we have a cross section of the spinal cord. And we're going to talk about the spinal cord in just a moment. If you were to look here at this yellow nerve here, neuron, I should say, okay, what shape does that have? Maybe at home you're saying, okay, there's the soma, the cell body. I have one process. Therefore, that looks like a unipolar neuron. Okay, so let me kind of hold it like this. So hopefully you're seeing that these two shapes match here, unipolar neuron. What did we say the job of a unipolar neuron is? To bring information to the central nervous system. So I love the question we got here. Okay, is that what causes a ganglion? Notice that this portion is bulging right here. This is called the posterior root ganglion. And the reason why it's bulged is because this is where we have all the cell bodies or the somas of those unipolar neurons. Okay, so hopefully you can see that is why it's bulging. It's because we have a cluster of all those cell bodies there. If we were to continue with this, okay, here I want to point this out because this is a term that I haven't addressed yet. Interneuron / association. Okay, an interneuron lies completely within the central nervous system. So you can see that this neuron, so this goes out, but this one, do you see how this is totally inside? That's what an interneuron is. And if we were to look closely at the shape, what shape does that have? It's multipolar. We also call this an association neuron. And the way that you can think of that is it associates between sensory and motor. Here, another multipolar neuron. This is our motor neuron. Okay, it looks like it has that multipolar shape. What job does it do? It provides information or carries the information to cause movement. It's motor function. So that information leaves the central nervous system and it connects to something called an effector. And this specific example, it's a skeletal muscle. Okay, but again, it can be other things in the body. So I like this visual aid a lot because it really summarizes, the concepts here and why it's important for us to know structural versus functional classification. Okay, so let's go on now and talk about the meninges. So the meninges are going to be a protective covering over the brain and the spinal cord. So again, this week we're only focusing on the spinal cord, but next week when we go over the brain, we're going to see these 3 meningeal layers covering the brain as well. So here I like to have this model right here. This kind of shows us a big picture of what we're looking at. So you can see we have a large vertebra right here. This, if my students, if you remember a few weeks ago, before we went on lockdown, these are the spinous processes of the vertebral column. So remember I said pick your favorite finger, okay, and then run it down the midline of your back. Those little think, think, thinks you feel are these spinous processes right here. So this is posterior, it's the back side of your body. These vertebral bodies are on the anterior side. So basically you're looking, this view is like you're basically looking at someone's side. If I were to go like this, okay, here we have those transverse processes right there. This would be a bird's eye view of the spinal cord. Okay, so right here we have the spinal cord. We will zoom into this in just a minute here. But I want to show you that we have these coverings. Again, I have a video that just talks about the meningeal layer. So if at any time you're not sure, like, hey, I need her to talk about that again after the session, go to my playlist and look at the videos over the meninges. So from deep to superficial, we have the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Those 3 coverings also have spaces in between them. And the spaces are the names of the spaces are very descriptive of where they are. So if this is the pia mater, which is covering the spinal cord directly, okay, so pia mater, arachnoid mater, what would be beneath the arachnoid mater? The subarachnoid space, because sub means below. That subarachnoid space is where we have cerebrospinal fluid. And if we have to perform a lumbar puncture, the needle actually gets inserted, and the needle will be coming through this direction. The needle would actually get inserted just into that subarachnoid space right there. And we can withdraw that fluid, send it to the lab, and our important folks in the lab will evaluate that and give a report as to what's in that fluid. Then superficial to that, meaning closer to the surface, we have that dura mater. Dura mater means tough mother. I love that. These names are so interesting. On the outside of the dura mater, if you want to think of it like that, is the epidural space. So you're thinking, hey, I've heard that word epidural before. What does that mean? The epidural space, if a woman has received an epidural, okay, during child labor, means the needle was inserted, but it didn't go into any of these layers. The needle just stays outside of those layers within the epidural space, because epi means above or outside. Okay, so the anesthetic gets injected out here, and what that does is that medicine will bathe these spinal nerves right here. We're going to talk about the spinal nerves in more detail in just a little bit, but an epidural goes here. That anesthetic will bathe these nerves, and that's what causes the numbness in that procedure. Let's see. So make sure, especially for my students here, make sure you guys know these meningeal layers. Meninges is plural for singular meninx. So know the order, and then know those spaces. And then I do want you to know that that cerebrospinal fluid flows within the subarachnoid space. Oh, so sorry for that crashing noise. I feel like every week I'm going to have some kind of prop drop. My AMP2, I did the urinary system. I know you guys are my AMP1 folks, so you may not care, but I had models falling apart on that session, and you just got to go with the flow. That's what we're doing now. Okay, so what I'd like to do then is before we go kind of big picture, I want to zoom in on the spinal cord itself. So let me grab this other model. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about these specific parts right here. So notice or remember, this is the spinous process. This is posterior. This is anterior. This is the vertebral body. Other things that kind of remind you of orientation here, these are the intervertebral discs, and I'm going to reference those in a little bit when we're talking about the nerve plexuses, but the intervertebral discs go in between each vertebra. So hopefully that kind of gives you a big picture concept of where we are. Okay, in the middle here, you'll notice that we have this gray colored stuff, and this is the gray matter, right? Then on the outside of that, we have white matter. So gray matter and white matter. We'll see those same terms next week in the brain, but the kind of interesting thing is that these, the position at least inverts. So just remember those terms because we're going to see that again next week. You'll notice that the gray matter looks like a butterfly or this H shape. So let me get another model to zoom in. All right. Again, I have a video that goes over all the pieces here if I'm going too fast for you during this live part. Right here in the center, okay, this is, let me get my pointer here. Right here in the center is the central canal. The name is very descriptive of where it is, which is super nice. The central canal is another place where cerebrospinal fluid flows. And that's important to remember because next week we're going to see how that central canal connects up here in the brain. We have these two grooves right here. Okay, these two grooves are, we have a sulcus and a fissure. So this right here, this is anterior. This is posterior. How do I know this is anterior? Well, you know, if you guys, you know, in class, you'll hear me say how much I don't really like rote memorization, but there are some things we just have to memorize to start off with. So when we're looking at this, see how this groove is a little bit wider or more prominent than this one? That's how you know that this is the anterior groove, and we call it the anterior median fissure. We will see that term fissure again next week when we talk about the brain. Okay, so that's the anterior median fissure. This is called the posterior median sulcus. We will see that term sulcus again next week in the brain as well. So little preview there. We have these portions of white matter, which are called funiculi. That's plural for singular funiculus. In years past, we have called these white columns, but that terminology has actually changed. So you may see these referred to as the posterior, lateral, and anterior white columns. But we've kind of moved on from that term, and now we're referring to these as funiculi or funiculus singular. So this would be the posterior funiculus, the right lateral funiculus, anterior funiculus, left lateral funiculus. Well, and you might be saying, how did she know which way was right and left? This is another thing that you guys know I like to do a lot, and that is orienting yourself with directional terms. If I told you that this is the anterior median fissure, you know that is the front side. Remember, that's the anterior is the front side, posterior is the back side. This is a bird's eye view, okay? So meaning the top of the head is up here and we are looking straight down. So to think of it like that, if this is the top, front, back, then this has to be the right side, this has to be the left side. And that's important to know, especially on structures within the spinal cord. I want you to know your lefts and rights. The gray matter is sectioned off into portions we call horns. And again, the nice thing is all that work you did at the beginning of the semester when we were looking at directional terms and things like that, you're just going to apply that here. So here we would have the right, so right posterior gray horn, right lateral gray horn, right anterior gray horn, left posterior gray horn, left lateral gray horn, left anterior gray horn. We have these parts in the middle. For my students, these are not terms that you'd have to know, but those are called commissures, and those just connect the two halves together like so. All right, so this should look pretty familiar to this other model over here. So let me grab this real fast, just so we can compare. And hopefully you're seeing the similarities there. Okay, so remember that bulge-like structure that's right here? Do you see that on this model right here? I'll hold this up for just a second and try to look at that. Okay. Remember that bulge is called, so this bulge right here is called the posterior root ganglion, or dorsal root ganglion, because posterior and dorsal mean the same thing. Why do we have a ton of synonyms in A&P? To stress you out, I guess, right? So remember, for my students, memorize whatever term, learn the term that you can memorize and spell correctly, okay? I'll be the one that keeps all of the possible answers in check here. So here, this is that posterior root ganglion. Why is this bulged? What structures make up this bulge-like area? The soma of the sensory or unipolar neurons. Let me tilt that like so. Okay, so these cell bodies are all clumped together right here. That is why this is bulged like that. It's also, notice the name, posterior root ganglion, meaning that this is on the posterior side of the spinal cord. So we're just reiterating and affirming our knowledge of directional terms and really understanding how this exists, where this sits in our body, I should say. This will connect to posterior root, excuse me. Okay, so posterior root ganglion, posterior root, and then we have these little rootlets that go into the posterior gray horn. Remember, sensory information is coming in the back side of the spinal cord. It's going to come up through here. It'll go into the spinal cord. The spinal cord is going to process that information. We have interneurons in here. And then the motor neuron, which is what? A multipolar neuron. Okay. That is going to be this part right here. So the reason why we have gray matter here is because this is where we have cell bodies and dendrites. Okay, these motor ones. So all of these right here make up the gray matter. The white matter is made up from myelinated axons. Remember those bundles that help propagate signals. So the anterior rootlets join to form the anterior root, and that is containing the motor information. This is efferent or efferent because it is exiting the spinal cord. Hopefully all these different ways I'm saying the same thing is kind of really helping you understand the story we're telling here, because we always want to try to tell a story. That makes learning this a bit easier. Where we have the common place of the posterior and anterior side. So notice that this is just one part right here, but inside the posterior, the sensory stuff is separated from the motor stuff. It's just kind of think of it like we've got two tracks right there. Okay. This is what the spinal nerve is. So if I were to get this model right here. Okay, here we have that posterior root ganglion. It's going in. This is the anterior root ganglion. This portion right here, where that number is, that's the spinal nerve. And when I was talking about the epidural procedure, that's what that anesthetic surrounds. It surrounds that spinal nerve. Okay, so hopefully you guys are kind of putting all of this together. Then we have these other structures called rami, branches, I should say. Posterior rami, or ramus is singular, rami is plural. So I've got two rami here. We also know that another reason why I like to use multiple models is because if you're like me and you're just looking at one thing, if I'm not getting it on that one thing, I'm not getting it. So I have to look at a bunch of different examples here. So the posterior rami, okay, we also know that's posterior because, hey, those are going towards that spinous process. Those are going to innervate our backsides, okay? Then the anterior rami, that's what we're about ready to look at. These anterior rami are going to run to the sides and anterior or front sides of our bodies. Those are what the nerve plexuses form from, these guys right here. We have these little communicants that are these structures right here. These will go into smaller areas. But the ones that we really want to focus now are these anterior rami. So as I kind of switch gears, if you guys have any questions in the or regarding what we've talked about so far, you can submit that. Okay, let me grab this. Take a stroll with me down my lab to my other visual aid here. Okay, we'll see if this works. I think it will. I think you guys will be able to see this. Okay, this is my little diagram that I've drawn here. Well, hold on one second. Okay, here we go. Okay, so just a reminder. Oops, let me back up a little bit. Okay, hopefully you can see I've drawn the brain, looks like a little fluffy cloud, and the spinal cord. Okay, so remember that the central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of the nerves, what we have been talking about. So today, for my students, we've really done a little bit of central nervous system and peripheral nervous system because that's the nature of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. Next week, when we are in the brain, we're only in the central nervous system. So let me kind of pull you guys in a little bit closer here. All right, so the spinal cord, which is what I've drawn in green here, only goes to level L1, or the first lumbar vertebra. Okay, L1 is approximately, this is very general, okay, because I obviously didn't draw every little detail here, but L1 is about this area. This structure right here that is cone-shaped, that is called the conus medullaris. So let me zoom you in. Let me show you this model that I have right here. Let me get on the other side of this. We'll kind of go back and forth so you can see. Okay, so just to orient yourself with this. Brain, So we're actually looking at, this model is kind of interesting. Pretend the person is lying on their back, okay? They're supine, they're face up. So this is the front of the brain, and we're basically looking at the inside. So this is the person's back down here. So looking at it like so, adjust this a little bit. Here we have, this is the cerebellum, and we have the medulla oblongata over here, and that's kind of where the spinal cord starts. We will look at that term again next week, and next week we're really tying everything together. So the spinal cord goes all the way down like this, and it ends here at this cone-shaped structure called the conus medullaris. Again, it's easy to kind of get freaked out by these terms because they're big, but cone-shaped conus medullaris. This is about the inferior portion of the first lumbar vertebra. Your spinal cord does not go all the way down. And maybe if you're like me, before I really took the time to learn this stuff, I just thought my spinal cord, I don't know, I just for some reason just thought it went all the way down, but it doesn't. It ends up here, kind of in your low back region. Oops, maybe. Okay, it doesn't go all the way down. It ends much higher than we think. You'll notice that there is a bundle of nerve rootlets. So we have these nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord as I showed you on the other model. There are two big enlargements. We have the cervical enlargement and the lumbosacral enlargement. And the enlargements are simply areas where you're going to see big groups of nerves coming off of the spinal cord. And the reason why is because those are going to go to our upper extremities and lower extremities. So it's a way that you can think of those cervical enlargements. Here, this group of nerve roots, that's called the cauda equina. So equina reminds us of horses, okay? So the cauda equina reminding us of horses. It looks like a ponytail. So we have little ponytails in our central nervous system. Right here, again, that's the conus medullaris. There's going to be a thin extension of the innermost meninx. Do you guys remember what that was called? The innermost layer of the meningeal layers is called the pia mater. And so we have this extension of the pia mater here that's going to go all the way down, and it will attach to the coccyx. Okay, so that is how basically all of this gets anchored down to a bony structure. And that little filament is called the filum terminal. The filum terminal. Kind of think it's the final filament, if you want to think of it that way. That filum terminal is just that single strand. All these other strands on the other side of it, those are spinal nerve roots from the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions, and those bundles are referred to as the cauda equina. Let's talk about the branches off of that and those plexuses. So let's go back to our little figure over here. Excuse me. Okay. So here we have our little, our diagram. This is the spinal cord. And what I've shown here are plexuses. So remember that the nerve plexuses come from the anterior or ventral rami from the spinal cord, those groups that come off. And we have some plexuses here that I want to draw your attention to. So starting superiorly and working inferiorly, like so. We have the cervical plexus. Okay, the cervical plexus comes from vertebra C1 to C5. And then C5, and really C4 area, C1 to C4. Then the C5 area to T1 area, that is going to be the brachial plexus. So remember, a plexus just describes a group or a bundle of nerves that originated from the anterior rami of the spinal cord. Let's look at the cervical plexus, which is what I showed up here in red. Those will come down, and they're going to innervate the head, neck, face. But there's one really important nerve that comes from that plexus, and that is the phrenic nerve. Now, I've only shown this on one side, but know that this would actually emit from both sides. So just try to keep it as simple and not cluttered up here. But this phrenic nerve, which comes from about area C4, and there are other connections as well, that is going to connect to the diaphragm, which is what we've shown by this line right here. What does the diaphragm allow you to do? Okay, yeah, I just used it to sigh and to think about, right? We use that to breathe. So the phrenic nerve innervates that very important organ that we come back to over and over again, even in my AMP2 class. So my AMP1ers here, I don't want you to think, oh, at the end of the semester, I'm done with AMP1. I don't have to think about the diaphragm again. Oh no, we come back to it in AMP2. And if this nerve gets damaged, we are in trouble, right? We might have to rely on mechanical ventilation to allow us to breathe. And in fact, when we think of cervical spine injuries, it matters at what level that injury occurred. Now, a cervical spine injury, this is just kind of an aside. It doesn't mean that this was like, torn necessarily. Bruising of the spinal cord can damage these nerves, these branches off of it. And so generally speaking, whatever level that injury occurred, everything inferior and distal to that is affected. So the higher up the spinous injury, the more parts of the body that can be affected. Things like paralysis and loss of movement. So people that need to be on a ventilator, it's likely because they had a much higher cervical injury, like the late actor Christopher Reeve. He had an injury in the C1, C2 area way up here. So pretty much everything, unfortunately, was negatively affected by that. So that's why we care about these plexuses. We can focus on, just at least to start out with, we can focus on some major nerves to help wrap all this together. Moving on to the brachial plexus, which is about areas C5 to T1. So remember, C stands for cervical vertebra. T stands for thoracic vertebra. So kind of the end or the lower end of the cervical area to the first part of the thoracic area, that's the brachial plexus. And the brachial plexus is actually quite complex. There are lots of ways that we organize the groups of nerves. We have things that kind of intermingle and mix, which is a really good thing. That means if you have damage to one part, it doesn't necessarily mean you lose all function, because we have other routes to kind of bypass that area. But the main things for my students I want you to just understand right now at this point is that from the brachial plexus, we follow that distally down the upper extremity, and I've just shown this on the left side, but again, remember, it's also on the other side as well. Okay, what nerve do you think is going to be pinky side? That is the ulna, so that's where we would have the ulnar nerve. Thumb side is the radius, so that's where we would have the radial nerve. Okay, so the radial nerve will run kind of on the thumb side, ulnar, more posterior, pinky side. So lateral versus medial. Think of it this way, the ulnar nerve. Have you ever hit your funny bone? Probably wasn't too funny, right? I don't think many of us laugh when that happens, or maybe we do because we just laugh when we get hurt. Okay, you didn't actually hit a bone. What you did was you smushed your ulnar nerve. Okay, you smushed your ulnar nerve up against your bony structures there. What do we have there? Well, you have your ulna, you have your humerus. Okay, there's a tract that runs through. Okay, that nerve runs through. And when you smush it up against those hard bony structures, that's what causes that really zingy pain. So it's kind of funny we call it the funny bone. You should just say, oh, I hit my ulnar nerve next time and sound really geeky. And then other geeks who are in earshot will be like, hey, I like that person. Okay, moving on. Let's go down here. Oh, so actually let's stay up here real fast because this is a question I get a lot. Mrs. Wade, where's the thoracic plexus? And we don't have one. And it's because the nerves in the thoracic region, remember your thorax, the nerves that come off of the anterior rami in that area actually form the intercostal nerve. So I'll just hold this up real fast. So in the thoracic region right here, these nerves that go in between the ribs, those are the intercostal nerves. And that's what we find, intercostal nerves instead of a thoracic plexus. No thoracic plexus, just intercostal nerves within that thoracic area. So now we can look at the lower regions. Let me kind of go like this. Move you closer. We have a lumbar plexus and a sacral plexus. Again, we do have this on both sides, but I've just simplified it so it's easier to see. Around areas L1 to L4, so your first lumbar vertebra to your fourth lumbar vertebra, we have the lumbar plexus. The major nerve, there are many nerves that come off of this, but the major one that we might think of is the femoral nerve. This femoral nerve is going to run more on the anterior side of the thigh area, okay, so the front side, and it will continue downward and branch. On the sacral plexus, okay, that's more inferior. Okay, that's going to come off of the sacrum, actually. And if I were to just hold this up, this is not to scale, FYI, but this is your sacrum. Okay, so here are your lumbar vertebra. Okay, lumbar vertebra. And then this is your sacrum. That's the coccyx. That is your tailbone, right? Okay, this is what can get fractured if you sit on your rear too hard, or this can actually get fractured in childbirth. Ouch. Okay, so that is going to be in this area right here. Again, this is not to scale, but the sacral plexus is going to emit from the sacrum. That kind of helps put things together. This will be in areas around L4 to S4, meaning the fourth, fifth lumbar vertebra to the fourth sacral vertebra. And the major nerve that we think of, again, there are several nerves that come off of the sacral plexus. Lots of different things we could talk about here. But the major one that I think a lot of us are familiar with is the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is our longest and widest nerve in the body. It mainly runs on the posterior side, on the back sides of our upper thigh area. This is why if we have back problems, if we have any kind of inflammation, so for instance, okay, a herniated disc. So remember earlier I said I talked about these intervertebral discs. That's what these are right here. If we have inflammation or they are herniated, meaning they're actually, or bulging is another term you might hear. Okay, it's kind of like bulging like that. You can see how that can impinge on all these nerves that are over here. So that's why herniated discs can cause back pain. If they are affecting nerves like in the sacral plexus, that may cause a condition known as sciatica. Okay, other things can cause that as well. We can have osteoarthritis, so bony degeneration can also affect the nerves in this area. Inflammation, things like that. So what we're saying here is if any of these little parts right here become impinged, that can cause shooting pains that radiate down the lower extremity. So that's why if you have heard or you've read about sciatica, people will have low back pain that shoots or radiates down the leg. It's because that's where that pain is being sensed. Okay, that's the part of the body that's being affected. So my big tips for these two is that the femoral nerve, more so on the anterior side, especially for my students when you're looking at pictures or you're looking at models, or even our feline specimen, which I have a video on that as well. Those are more easily located on the anterior side, the front side of the leg, the sciatic nerve on our back side. So I kind of think S for sciatic, S for sacral plexus, and you sit on that part of your leg. Okay, so when we're sitting down, okay, we're sitting on our posterior side. That's the sciatic nerve, which comes from the sacral plexus. Okay, I know we are just chugging along here. And there's a lot to this. So let me wheel us back just to right here. And let me take a look at what we have, just make sure I'm not missing any major things. So let me grab that reflex arc real fast. This is just kind of a review. I love information that will go along the afferent or afferent pathway. Sorry, I'm getting my lab manual here so I don't skip over any terms that you guys may want to hear. Okay, we have a receptor. In this example, it's the skin. Okay, that signal is going to go to the central nervous system. In this example, it's the spinal cord. We notice that this is the afferent or afferent pathway because afferent means to go towards something. What are we going towards? The central nervous system, the spinal cord. When we look at that, we notice, hey, that is a unipolar neuron. Those soma cell bodies there are clumped together. Okay, that's that posterior root ganglion. So this sensory information goes in the back side of the spinal cord into that dorsal or posterior gray horn. It will go through here, and that motor information will exit. It's the efferent or efferent pathway. It will leave like so and connect to an effector. It could be a muscle or a gland. We have different types of reflexes. So just little tips here. We can further break up our reflexes into cranial or spinal. All that means is cranial means that the signal went all the way to the brain. If it's spinal, that just means it went to the spinal cord. So it's very straightforward there. And then we can further break that up into either a visceral or somatic reflex. So remember that somatic, so soma means body. Those typically innervate areas that we are consciously aware of. So a somatic sense is something like our five senses. We are consciously aware that, oh, I'm smelling something, or I'm seeing something, or I'm feeling something. That's a somatic sense. A somatic reflex would be a neuron that attaches to like a skeletal muscle. So when I put my hand on something hot and I yoink it away, that would be a somatic reflex because it attached to skeletal muscle, which again, I'm consciously aware of that control. Then we have visceral reflexes. Visceral reflexes are more on the autonomic side, meaning we don't really have conscious control of that. For instance, when you are salivating. Okay, you're really hungry, or you drive by Chick-fil-A or whatever, you're like, oh man, that looks really good, and your mouth starts watering. You don't really have control over that. So that would be an example of a visceral. Remember, viscera refers to inner organ. We looked at that when we were going over serous membranes. And so it's the same thing. Visceral neurons or visceral reflexes tend to attach to things like glands or the inner workings of organs, things that that are happening, but we don't really pay attention to. We're not having to really think about what's happening there. So for instance, if I were to say, okay, blinking, let's talk about what type of let's talk about the classification of the reflex of blinking. So blinking would be cranial or spinal? Cranial, right? And then those innervate skeletal muscles, which we'll look at this in a few weeks when we talk about sense organs. So that would be a somatic reflex, because and we can consciously, if you want to sit there and blink, you can do that. So that also kind of tells you that's a somatic reflex, excuse me. And then if we were to, okay, so salivation, I talked about that a minute ago. That's cranial. Okay, it's up here, but it's a visceral reflex, because you don't actually sit there and think, okay, start drooling all over the place. It just kind of happens. And you'll have glands that will secrete that fluid into your mouth. Okay, so I think that's all. We are at an hour, and man, oh man, I hate that. You know, it was just an hour of me talking, but I understand I understand that it's kind of hard to interact in this sense, but I hope that me talking through the exercise that we have in a more conversational sense is helpful. I know I've got all those videos, but sometimes it's helpful to see it when I'm, you know, pointing at stuff in person. So before we head out, I just want to double check. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. You can comment on this video. You can send me a message through Canvas, and just let me know. I know there's a lot to this, so take it in bite-sized chunks. I recommend start with just neuron anatomy. Make sure you understand the different parts of the neuron, and you say, okay, when a signal comes through, this is the direction it travels. There, good start. Then remind yourself of, okay, how does a neuron fit within the central nervous system? Oh, they're located here. Slowly but surely build onto that, so that you're not looking at the whole exercise we have and you're going, oh my word, how in the world am I going to learn this? And I think you guys will have a lot of success doing it that way. Okay, I don't see any questions, so you guys stay safe out there, and I hope this video helps you. Take care.